Tennessee Titans fans, we are going back a few months for this one. This is the cast and crew of NFL Live reacting to the Mike Vrabel firing. You all remember how the media reacted to this, so I'm sure this is going to be good. Dan Orlovsky leading the way. I like Dan, so I hope this is not too bad.
Big news today is the list of teams with a head coach opening grew when Mike Vrabel was fired this afternoon. That means, as you see there, we now have 7 head coach openings as of right now. The Panthers, Raiders, Chargers, Falcons, Commanders, and now the Titans all looking for a coach. Dan Graziano here with us, and that is where we begin. Graz, what can you tell us about how this went down in Tennessee?
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, look, there were some discussions that were planned after the season. Obviously, the season ended on Sunday between head coach Mike Vrabel and ownership. And if you listen to the comments and read the comments of team owner Amy Adams-Strunk, it sounds very clear that she believed that Mike Vrabel and the general manager Ran Carthon, who was hired a year ago, were not in alignment on the vision for the franchise. And so she made the decision to move on from Vrabel, which...
Well, you dang right they weren't aligned. And here's the thing. Do I believe that Vrabel and Ran Carthon got along? Yes. I think we can surmise by everything we've heard Rand say about Vrabel and vice versa. I don't think they, were at each other's throat all the time. I actually think they probably had a pretty good relationship, but that is not the same as having the same vision for this organization. You know, and what the roster needs to be and what the philosophy needs to be. You can get along and be friends and still not have the same vision for the organization.
It's an interesting decision given the success he's had as a head coach there, but that's the direction that the Tennessee Titans have decided to go. It looks like they're headed into a rebuild, and she has made it clear. Again, this is not reading between the lines. This is reading what she actually said. That she wants a coach in there that's aligned with Ran Carthon moving forward as they begin to rebuild and ideally head back to the kind of success they had, under Vrabel.
Here's the thing. The Titans were going to be rebuilding either way. Even if they kept Vrabel, the roster still sucked. The roster still had holes all over the place, with rare exception. So even if they kept Vrabel, you're still looking at a rebuild. You can't have 2 seasons like the Titans have had with a roster like that and expect to just keep everything the same, And so when you're looking at that rebuild, if you have a dude who's got an outlook and a philosophy on what things need to be that you don't agree with, if that person has an outlook that you can look at and say, hey, this doesn't sound like it's actually going to fix or rebuild anything, then you need to let him go. And they can talk about the success that Mike Vrabel had in Tennessee. He did, but as you can see in the last 2 seasons, 13-31. So
Graz with us all show long, and we've got a lot more on this. We'll hit it a few times in the show because there's so many different ways to look at it. I think we can all agree that Mike Vrabel is one of the best coaches in the NFL right now, which makes his firing that much more confusing. Welcome to NFL Live. Lots to get to, as I said. Dan Orlovsky's here.
He's such a great coach. What was you guys' outlook on the Tennessee Titans going forward if he was such a great coach? One of the best in the league. If that's true, and this is not an anti-Mike Vrabel podcast or channel, but if the outlook for Tennessee was so great, who'd you guys have winning the AFC South next year? Who'd you have coming in second? Who'd you have coming in third? You're acting like the Titans were in such a great position with Vrabel. They were an afterthought.
Mina Kimes is there. Marcus Spears joining us in just a little bit. We're going to start with Mina. We're going to start with Dan here, actually. You think this is the right decision for the Titans right now?
No, because Mike Vrabel is such a great coach.
Yeah.
Now, I can understand it if philosophically you want to go in a different direction and whatnot, but you don't just find guys that are great coaches to the level that Mike Vrabel is. And it really goes to this. The moment that they decided organizationally to trade A.J. Brown was the beginning of the end.
Who was the coach when that happened? Well, I do believe John Robinson is the biggest person to blame for that fiasco, but Vrabel was there. Vrabel could have spoken up. Vrabel, Vrabel sat in a press conference right after that happened and said, I'm fine with this. This is great.
League, like so often, coaches get fired because they can't coach. That is not the place, or the case, excuse me, in Tennessee. The reason Mike Vrabel got fired, at least when it comes to the results, is the roster. This team has not drafted well. Take Rand Carthon's draft this year out. This team has not drafted well since really 2019 when they drafted Jeffrey Simmons and A.J. Brown in 1 and 2. Ever since then, the first 2 rounds have been just whiff after whiff after whiff, essentially. So
that's correct.
It's hard to sit here and think that they're going to find a better coach. If Rand Carthon wants to make this decision and their ownership wants to make the decision for philosophy reasons, I understand that. But, man, Vrabel can flat out coach.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I told you before I started that I like Dan, and I agree with that. I do. Vrabel's not getting fired for being a bad coach. Vrabel is not getting fired for being a guy that is incapable of coaching in this league. Absolutely. He'll get another job, probably somewhere next year, as a head coach. But I think there's just a larger issue here that you can't truly see if you're just looking at the surface. It's what the Titans have always been. They've always been old school, run the ball, win games 12-10, bore everybody to death, and, maybe they squeak into the playoffs. Like, that's what they've always been. And while Mike Vrabel is good at taking the guy at the bottom and making him a Sunday level player, the Titans need a complete overhaul of philosophy, and I think it's that important. They need a complete overhaul in philosophy. They need a complete overhaul in mindset and roster. And I'm not going to say Vrabel was innocent in that roster either. I mean, there was some stubbornness from him.
And it does make you think, do they already have their person that they want? I mean, if they were going to make this decision.
For the quickness of it?
Maybe.
Yeah.
We're all trying to figure it out. I guess we'll find out. You did mention A.J. Brown. A reminder to those out there that, of course, they traded away A.J. Brown to the Eagles.
No.
Mina, is this Titans job a desirable job for whoever gets it next?
It's a tricky one, largely because of what Dan alluded to, which is the state of the roster. And it's a state that's kind of confusing, which I suspect the more I think about it might be why they moved on from Vrabel or why there was this parting of ways, because it clearly wasn't for coaching reasons. I think we all agree he's an excellent coach. But I found this team sort of hard to read coming into this season because on one hand, they were clearly rebuilding. You take a guard and a quarterback in the draft this last year. Nobody, I think, saw them as a real contender in the AFC. But then on the other hand, there were some moves made, signing DeAndre Hopkins, holding on to some of the veterans like Ryan Tannehill instead of trading them, that made me ask, well, are you trying to compete or are you trying to rebuild? It felt like they were on 2 timelines at the same time, and I can't help but wonder if perhaps what Vrabel wanted, how he viewed this season, how he viewed the roster generally, might be different or might have been different from where the organization wanted to go.
Yeah, I think that's a smart.
I agree with her take. I mean, the Titans were confusing last year. I agree. I was of the mindset, like many of you, that they were rebuilding, and then they signed DeAndre Hopkins, and I was like, okay, well, that's not something you do if you're just, rebuilding. And then, when the trade deadline came and Derrick Henry was still on the roster and Ryan Tannehill was still on the roster, it was like, we traded Kevin Byard, but that's the thing. We traded Kevin Byard, which would hint at like, okay, we're rebuilding, we're cleaning house. You remember when they traded Byard, everybody was just waiting because it was like the Titans are about to let a bunch of people go. And then they didn't. And it's like, okay, so we kind of are trying to have it both ways. We want to rebuild, but we also want to like compete. And I would love to know how much of it did Vrabel have something to do with that? Like who was wanting to rebuild? Who was wanting to try to compete? Like what was going on? Because it was confusing. It was mixed signals.
Conclusion. Reminder, too, that Derrick Henry, a free agent, they're going to be parting ways. Sure. He said his farewell already to Tennessee. Marcus is here now. Swagoo, what are your thoughts on the firing of Vrabel today?
Swagoo.
Made it.
It's in line with what Dan talked about. I mean, look, we've watched this league over the time that we started this show, and it's very difficult to find a coach that you can trust in a lot of situations, a guy that you know if you build a roster around him, you can have a tremendous amount of success. I remember us sitting in the studio scratching our head when they decided to trade A.J. Brown away. This team is not far removed from being the 1 seed going into the playoffs with Mike Vrabel as their head coach. This was a roster problem, and I think he's a victim of that. And to Mina's point, it kind of became no man's land for the Tennessee Titans, and as far as their direction. And it seems that Mike Vrabel is taking the brunt of the blame for that. When they brought in Rand Carthon, I thought this relationship would materialize with Mike Vrabel, and they would start making decisions roster construction-wise to put this team in a situation where they could compete every single year. And like I said, he won't be unemployed too long. Don't feel sorry for Mike Vrabel. He will not be unemployed for a long time, and somebody is going to get a hell of a head coach.
I do think.
Swagoo, you wanna backtrack on that statement right there? I would tend to believe that that yes, the roster was the biggest issue, and they're saying Vrabel was a victim of that. I think Vrabel was a one of the reasons for that. I mean, Vrabel had, from at least from what I understand, Vrabel had significant influence on most things that happened in the organization. Like, he wanted to keep fielding guys that fit his mold of what we've heard what Brian Callahan and his crew have said since they got here. They have said, hey, we're going to put each player in the best position to succeed. We're going to look at what that player is good at, and we're going to put them out there in a position to do what they're good at and comfortable with. And I don't think that's what Vrabel did. Vrabel wanted guys that were able to adapt to his mold of what he thought the team should be. So I
think the roster, Mina, and the job is a little bit more appealing than maybe just because Will Levis had some highs this year. You know, the offensive line, Peter Skoronski, their first rounder, looks pretty promising. Spears, they need a lot more help on the perimeter. And there's some young pieces on defense that are solid players, not great. For Rand Carthon, their general manager, he's got to find his Mick Shanahan. You know, that group of tree coaches, because he's been in San Francisco, or was in San Francisco, since 2017, and the elite coordinators that he was around are all head coaches. Yeah. I mean, Robert Saleh, D'Amico Ryans, Mike McDaniel. So my mind naturally immediately goes to Houston's offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick. I would imagine.
It's so fascinating to watch this back in the context of knowing who they hired and what has happened now as we sit here on July 5th. Like, I can't, like, when you look at what all the Titans have done so far this offseason and pickups in the draft and everything, like, it's been a complete overhaul of the entire roster that I don't think they could have possibly seen coming at this time.
That Rand Carthon, because they're tied together in San Francisco, that would be one of their first interview requests. But I do think that because of Levis's intrigue, the roster's a little bit more appealing than maybe the record implies.
I like McShanahan. Makes more sense than like Shaniel, I guess would be the other way to go about it.
Sorry, my computer malfunctioned, but we're back.
Ability he has. So that to me is job number one for Tennessee. Well, job number one, rather, is to address the offensive line. That is job number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You got Skoronski. You got a lot of work to do elsewhere to make Levis functional next year. But I think finding a coach who fits what they want to do and what is suited to the young quarterback would be the next job.
And see, that's why the situation is perplexing. And I understand where you're coming from, D.O. and MK, as far as that tree. But you knew you had a really good head coach. You don't know if you have a really good quarterback.
Totally.
And that's the issue that arises when I think about this situation with Mike Vrabel walking out of the door. It could go south. Hopefully it doesn't. But to let a guy like this walk out of the door, and when you hear his players speak about him, and how these guys actually fought for him in a game that meant nothing at the end of the season just this past weekend.
I mean, they literally throw that out all the time. Oh, they won their last game in a game that didn't even mean anything. They went out and beat Jacksonville. They bring that up all the time as if that's never happened before. There have been teams with some of the worst coaches you've ever seen who were able to go out and win a Week 18 game just based on just their pride alone, you know. So apparently the fact that the Titans were able to scrounge together a win over the Jags in Week 18 means that Vrabel's just the greatest coach of all time. Here's the thing. He has a point. If things go south with Brian Callahan, if he's not a good coach, yeah, you're going to have people who are saying, hey, Vrabel wasn't a bad coach. But I think that, you know, clearly there are probably things going on in that building that we'll never know. But I think it's not unreasonable to say, is Mike Vrabel the kind of coach you want to have to develop a young guy like Will Levis in an offense that is so stagnant all the time, that wants to run the ball on first and second down most of the time, that's so predictable and so conservative and so boring, you know? And some of that had to do with that offensive line.
It's hard for me to accept the fact that he was the problem and you thought you needed to fix this part of your football team.
Marcus, let's get back to Vrabel on all of this. We've talked about what happened in Tennessee. But where could you see Vrabel landing? I think he's one of the best coaches in the entire league. Who wants him?
I agree with you, and I think the Washington Commanders should have a plane on the way right now. And I was thinking about something as
they chose Dan Quinn, fellas. Dan Quinn. Mike Vrabel, assistant coach in Cleveland, as Dan, by God, Quinn gets the job in Washington.
We talked about this. Josh Harris and his group, he hired Bob Myers to be a part of this search firm. And Bob Myers comes from the Golden State Warriors, where a former player has led that team to 4 NBA championships in Steve Kerr. And I think it has to be something in the thought process of how you can duplicate that success on the NFL side. Mike Vrabel has already proven he can coach. He's already proven he can motivate. He's proven that he actually can win games when his roster is not constructed in a way for you to have a tremendous amount of success in this league. But I think with that group and how they've been positioned, there's some familiarity with a former player being a head coach and having the type of cachet that Mike Vrabel has. Steve Kerr was an NBA champion as a player. He's an NBA champion as a coach, and I think there's a lot of correlation there with the Commanders and where they are positioned now.
But you know what I love so much about Vrabel as a coach and why I think he's such a desirable candidate? He has all of the former player bona fides you talked about. Players play for him. But he also is very forward-thinking. Dan called the game where he went for 2 down 8. Laura, you were there. I love that. But he's also has this long history of knowing the rules better than other coaches.
And that's another thing too. It's like, oh, how could you fire this guy? He knows the rules so well. Like, okay, so we should keep the guy because he knows the rule book,
and being very strategic about that. I think where it gets interesting and potentially a little tricky is if you're a team that needs a coach, you say, oh my gosh, Mike Vrabel's open. That is free. That's amazing. But Bill Belichick might be available.
Dude, this is fascinating to watch in hindsight, because the only coach they're saying that was more appealing than Vrabel was Belichick, and neither one of them got hired. Oh, no.
Jim Harbaugh is likely available. And then you have amazing candidates like Ben Johnson, Ben Johnson's offensive coordinator for the Lions, Mike McDonald, the defensive coordinator for the Ravens, Raheem Morris in Los Angeles.
Atlanta.
I would argue, Dan, that this is as good a selection of head coaches that I can remember. And honestly, it also, I think, casts a light on teams that are debating whether to keep their coaches right now, like your Chicagos, your New Orleans, and whatnot, knowing that all of these guys are available.
Yeah, I think your point's accurate, and that's why you can understand the owners in Tennessee saying, the philosophies have to match up, and I think that's going to be a huge part of this head coach hiring cycle is if you're the general manager of the organization, do you align with that head coach's philosophy in both, like how
Apparently nobody aligned with Vrabel's philosophy.
you're going to build your roster, how you want to play football? I agree, like Washington should call. Obviously, New England, if they decide to do something outside of Coach Belichick, should call. I think the two teams that would be interesting would be, and I don't think they're going to get fired, but if they decide to walk away, would be Pittsburgh and/or Seattle. If either of those coaches
Seattle
decides, hey, I'm going to retire, I don't know how likely that is.
Yeah.
You probably call those situations.
All right, we'll go ahead and call it there. Yeah, I do agree with some of what they said there. I do agree with some of it. The roster was an issue. Like, there were a lot of issues. But to act like Vrabel deserves no blame, I'm never going to be on board with that. And being a Titans fan, as long as I have been, philosophy needed to change. And I'll just leave it at that. Tighten up, everybody.